Great. Okay, so welcome back for your second lecture on operations, business operations. Today, our focus is going to be more around thinking about operations management and the role of the operations manager in the planning function. Okay, so if you recall last time around on Friday, we looked at what operations management is, how operations management is important to an organization, and where an operations management function can improve the business processes, the efficiencies, etc., etc. So it's very much an introductory landing for what operations means and how operations covers a vast array of different areas within an enterprise. So what are we going to be doing this afternoon? So a couple of objectives to cover off with you today, particularly around being able to distinguish between what we know as strategic, tactical, and detailed planning. Now, the next session on Wednesday is going to look specifically at operations strategy. So this is kind of an introduction or almost like a stepping stone to getting you there. So strategic, tactical, and detailed types of plans very much cover an array of different strategic outlooks, we could say, on operations, and describe why the role of sales and operations planning, or what we call S&OP, are important to an organization as well as a supply chain partner. So we'll look at how operations planning combined with sales is a significant driver for not only the company that we or you and I may work for, but also for any supply chain, so backwards and forwards integration. We will look at describing the differences between top-down and bottom-up sales and operations planning processes, and we'll discuss the strengths and weaknesses of stuff like level, chase, and mixed production strategies. Again, these will become a little bit clearer as to what these are and how they work as we go through the lecture series today. I also want you to be able to discuss the organizational issues that arise when firms decide to incorporate sales and operations planning into their efforts. So, what are the kind of issues that may emerge, what are the kind of tensions or the dialectical, perhaps, outlooks that may come to the fore. I want you to be able to describe the managerial considerations, particularly around the use of S&OP in a service environment, to be able to examine how sales and operations planning can be used to coordinate activities within a supply chain, and finally, the use of optimization. We're not going to actually look at doing optimization. I just want you to be aware of how optimization is useful as a tool in the S&OP process. Okay, so that at a very kind of high level, or in a nutshell, is what today's lesson is all about. So without further ado, really, I'm going to start by introducing to you the context of sales and operations planning, and hopefully bring that to life with a couple of discussions. So essentially, it's a process that's used to develop tactical plans. Now you're probably wondering, well, what does that mean? What is a tactical plan and why is a tactical plan important? Well, it's to integrate our marketing plans for new and existing products and to allow us to manage our supply chain. So tactical, firstly, is the day-to-day running of our organization, okay? So tactical is everything that's to do with the here and now, whether it's today, whether it's tomorrow, whether it's next week, it's what are we working on right now, what's important to us. So S&OP will bring together most of the plans that the business has, whether it's strategic long-term, so it could be, what we're looking to achieve in 5-10 years' time, whether it's, where we want to be this time next year. It's about bringing all those plans together and saying, well, what does that actually mean today? What can I achieve with my organization today? What is my company, or what is my functional area, my department, having to do today to be able to get us to hit the target, to hit the goal for 6 months, 1 year, 10 years, however long the overall strategy may be for. It's also known as what we call aggregate planning. Okay, so there's different functions of planning, and planning is important at different layers of an organization. But for operations, tactical planning is what's called aggregate planning, because everything combined is what contributes to what we're doing today. Okay, what we're doing today should relate back to the strategic direction of the company. It should relate back to what the company, in terms of it's local level it's trying to achieve. So say, for example, you're part of Coca-Cola and you're working in the US franchise, there'll be certain targets that the US franchise will want to achieve, or might be different to China or Europe or Asia, etc. So again, thinking about what those are, it's also about incorporating your local strategy. So for example, you might be working in a specific bottling plant, you might be working in a specific production facility where you've got specific local targets. So all of those combined together will give you your aggregated plan or your aggregate plan. So that's in a nutshell what sales and operations planning is all about. It's about turning the grand scheme, the grand strategies into workable day-to-day targets, workable day-to-day objectives for your people to follow. And the planning cycle looks a little bit like this. So we want to have a 4-step process, basically. We want to understand what demand planning will look like. Demand planning is important because you need to understand what customers want, what demand is there for your products. Firstly, is there a demand? Because if there's no demand, you don't want to be doing any activity, you don't want to be creating products that are just going to sit in your warehouse and not go anywhere. Supply planning. So again, what do you need to deliver on that demand? What's the resources that are required? When do you need to be here? How are you going to combine those resources? How will these resources be used most efficiently? Partnership meeting. Now, this is more getting into the maintenance side of your S&OP. So as an operations manager, you will meet with partners, whether that be internally, so different functional areas, departments, whether that be externally with your supply chain. You will meet people to ensure that everyone's aligned to the same plan. Everyone understands how they are contributing to the plan. And finally, executive S&OP meetings. These are the senior ones, okay? This is when you have senior management. This is when you have senior stakeholders also present, and they'll be looking to test you on how well you're performing against, you know, the strategies that you've set yourself. So your tactical plans, your tactical day-to-day operations, how are you delivering on that? So those are the 4 steps that go into a monthly cycle. Each month, you're responsible for checking up on what's going on in your area, checking in with your wider network in terms of partners, and finally checking into your senior leadership team to be able to explain what you're doing and how that relates to the organization's pursuit of certain targets. So coming back to the S&OP planning cycle, so we talked about tactical quite a lot there, and tactical very much is the kind of effective and efficient utilization of resources. Okay, that's very much the focus of an S&OP strategy at tactical level. It's all about the here, the now, the today. We then have tactical, which is the middle level. So this is more about longer term in the context that you may be making decisions here to do with location strategy. Are you in the best possible position locally in terms of making sure you've got access to the best resources, you've got good logistical links to be able to transport your products, so on and so forth. It could be around new product establishment. So again, thinking about what new products and services might your organization want to introduce to continue or even to enhance its product offering. And also around monitoring of budgets. So again, this year you spent, say, 500 million. The next 2 years, you want to reduce that to 400 million or 450 million. So you want to make a savings of 50 million. How are you going to do that? What's going to be required? So on and so forth. And then we have at the top level, the strategic strategy. Generally speaking, as an operations manager, you likely won't have much exposure and or input into defining the strategic level strategy. However, because of your position in the organization, you'll likely be consulted to ensure that what top management is thinking is A, feasible, i.e. can it be done? You know, if your operations, you know them better than anyone else. Can we do this? And B, how can we then turn that into a policy that is easy for you to deliver on the ground? So it's one thing coming up with a high level strategy. It's another thing making it realistic and making it feasible. So the strategic S&OP tends to be, for an operations manager, a way of him or her being kept in the loop. So he or she knows where the organization is looking to go and how that might impact their operation. The tactical tends to be more decisions made about the medium-term future, so perhaps 2, 3, 4, 5 years down the line. And then finally, the operational is very much here and now. What are we doing this week, this month, or even today, as the case may be in some instances. So before I move on, any questions on the cycle between strategic, operational, and tactical? Everyone clear on how that works and why it's important? I'll take silence to be golden. Okay, well, if you're all happy, then I guess all I can really do is move on to the next stage. So why do we do sales and operations planning? Well, it's to help us indicate how the organization will use its tactical capacity of resources to meet the customer demand. So we talked about demand planning and supply planning, but essentially what you're doing is you're trying to understand, you've got a lot of capacity, you've got resources, you've got machinery, you've got perhaps equipment, etc. How are you going to best configure that? What's the best bundle of resources or configuration options that will allow you to meet the demand of your customer? It's also to help you strike a balance between the various needs and constraints of the supply chain. So again, it's about understanding where your suppliers are, what your suppliers are doing, where do they fit in this grand scheme of your organization, and then trying to translate that into where does that fit in with our plans? How does what our suppliers are looking to do relate to what we're looking to do? Will they continue supplying us in 5 years' time, or will they have moved on to something different? Will we still need them in 5 years' time, or will we need someone different to deliver our needs? Okay, so it's all about making sure there's that synergy, there's that partnership that's important. It serves as a coordinating mechanism for the various supply chain partners. So again, one of the reasons why we do this type of planning exercise, again, is to ensure consistency. Say, for example, you are a large car manufacturer, you're a BMW or you're a Mercedes. You can't produce everything in-house. Stuff like the tires will come from, someone like Michelin or Pirelli. Your seats will come from some other seat upholsterer, or people that could create chairs and seats. The dashboard will come from some plasticky material or, rubber material manufacturer. The sound system for your car might come from Bose, or it might come from one of the audio companies. So again, they're all suppliers that supply products to BMW or Mercedes or whoever else. It's important that they're constantly in dialogue to ensure that the correct parts are arriving at the correct time into the correct facility for it to go into the car. So these are all things that are important. So it's about coordinating the supply of goods and services. That is something that's quite important, particularly when it comes to raw materials or materials that go into your manufacturing process. What you don't want to do is have a car that's sitting on the production line because tires won't arrive for 3 weeks, or they won't arrive until next week, and you've got 100 cars sitting there that need tires before they can roll off. That's a problem, okay? So it's about making sure that you've got everything coordinated, everything's running smoothly. And finally, it's a way of expressing the business plan in terms that everyone can understand. So again, regardless of whether you work on a particular section of the car, you might be someone who beats the metal to turn it into a panel that goes on the bonnet of the car. At least you know from the plan what your job is, where you fit in, what you're looking to do, how many bonnets you need to mold, how many panels you need to beat, so on and so forth. Everyone that is involved in the completion of that car will know his or her responsibility, will know his or her role in that process. And that's what your sales and operating plan is all about. It's about understanding, based on demand, what is the operations that need to be in place, that need to be forecasted in order for us to continue operating. A couple of different approaches to sales and OP. Firstly, there is the top-down approach. So top-down approach, as you may well imagine, is all about how do we approach it from senior level downwards. Okay, it's a way in which we have a single aggregated sales forecast that drives the planning process. So again, what you tend to find is senior management will have some kind of forecasting tools, whether it's through the marketing team, the sales team. They will have some kind of forecast around how they expect performance to be over the next 12, sometimes even 24 months. How do we anticipate the growth of our sales? to be Y. They'll have done a lot of analysis to gather that information. So they'll use that to drive decisions that are to be made in your organization, okay? And that's something that is important in terms not only of ensuring consistency, because everyone's operating the same plan, the same numbers, so what senior management are giving to everyone in the organization, but also to ensure that there is clarity around what the next 12 to 24 months might look like. That's important, because if you don't know what the future is going to look like, or you don't have an indication of what your future might look like, then the rest of it's rendered redundant. Okay, there's no point in doing an exercise if you don't have an indication of what you're actually working towards. So that's a top-down approach. We also have what's called the bottom-up planning approach, and that's very much, and that should say S&OP, sorry, that's a typo in my slides. So the approach to sales and operations planning that is used when the product or service mix is unstable and resource requirements vary greatly across the offering. So you might be thinking, well, what does that mean? Well, basically, it's sometimes almost impossible to predict demand. Demand can be quite unstable for your products and your resources, and can actually vary quite significantly across your offering. So for cars, it's quite consistent-ish. I mean, obviously there'll be times when the market, reacts to outside forces. Like, for example, when COVID hit, all the markets just fell. So that was an externality no longer planned for. But generally speaking, organizations that produce cars, they're able to kind of forecast demand fairly well. They don't tend to have too many issues with forecasting the demand roughly around what numbers they anticipate to sell each year. However, there are some industries where that can be quite difficult to achieve, particularly around fashion. Firstly, because fashion is so temporal, it relies on time, it relies on what's trending. Your products might be trendy today, but that doesn't mean they're going to be trendy in 3 or 4 months' time. It's what people want today, but what they want tomorrow may well change. So the fashion industry tends to adopt what's called a bottom-up planning approach. And basically, that's essentially done whereby planning values are used to identify the decision makers, and then we use that to create a sales forecast using resource requirements to determine the feasibility of alternative sales and operations plans. So again, that's just a fancy way of saying we have people that are close to the market, people that maybe are designers, people that maybe are producers, maybe they're even the sellers, the ones that are responsible. They're the ones that are picking up signs from the market. They're closest to the customer. They're the ones that perhaps interact with customers, they interact at fashion shows. They're able to kind of guess or start to see trends in the fashion market, and they can then feed that back up the organization. Hence why it's called the bottom-up approach. Okay, the CEO of the biggest fashion house may have some idea because he or she may have contacts in the industry, but generally speaking, they rely on their people, the ones that are actually out there gathering design ideas, gathering stuff. They'll be the ones that can feed in information that will be useful for the company to use. So that's the kind of general distinction between top-down and bottom-up planning. Any questions on that? Anyone not clear on the difference? No? Everyone clear on how to distinguish between top-down and bottom-up? And the example that I gave you of the fashion industry compared to automobile manufacturer, does that make sense? I need you to talk to me, guys. I need to know that you're following this. Oh, it's a chat come through. Perfect, that's great. Thank you. Okay, so how do you determine which approach is best? So hopefully what I've kind of explained to you makes sense. So obviously the type of industry you're in will have a direct impact. Okay, so if you're in the fashion industry, you'll probably have an impact, or you have a consideration of which is more important. Similarly, if you are in the automobile manufacturer, you will have an indication of what's more important to you in a similar vein, okay? But how do we distinguish if we're in one of the industries where both maybe apply? Maybe there is times when your industry is quite stable and it's quite clear. Other times industry is quite rapid. So for example, the companies that were producing PPE, personal protective equipment, before COVID hit, they had a steady stream of demand from mostly surgical sectors or sectors where, you know, surgeons, etc., wanted to cover their mouth or face before they operated. All of a sudden, as a result of COVID-19, everyone wanted a mask. So, you know, their demand went through the roof, maybe 1,000-fold, probably even more than 1,000-fold. Their demand was ridiculously high. That wouldn't always be feasible or possible, okay? A lot of it comes down to the element of, well, why do we need to go down a certain path? Why is some path more important than others? Well, it comes down to different approaches to the production strategy, okay? So whether you're following a level, a chase, or a mixed doesn't really make much difference, because they both can, three of them can be used under top-down and bottom-up planning. Where it's important is thinking about the mix of products. What you tend to find, for example, in someone that produces personal protective equipment is, irrespective of you know, that one product, they'll probably do multiple others. They won't just produce the masks. They won't just produce surgical equipment, or sorry, surgical protective gear. They'll probably have their fingers in a lot of different pies, to be honest. Okay, that's quite important as a point to note. Secondly, we also have the marketing mix, or the product mix, I should say, sorry. That comes from, well, how will the demand differ for our product on a month-to-month basis? And that comes back to the fashion example that I gave you. We can't predict how people are going to enjoy or not enjoy using our products. Sorry, my laptop seems to have crashed. I'm trying to select, but it's not letting me select. Sorry, it's not letting me move on to the next slide. Yes, so depending on what industry we're in, that will have an impact, as well as the nature of our products. Okay, that's the point we're trying to get across here. Right, my laptop seems to have, I'm just going to stop the share just for a second, just so I can see if, okay. Sorry, it's working now. Apologies, technology's given up on me there for a second. Right, so top-down planning approach. What is the process for it? Well, we need to develop the aggregate sales forecast and the planning values. That's step one, okay? We need to have an understanding of where do we see this going, and that will, generally speaking, as I said, come from senior management. They'll have people working on forecasting and people working on what, you know, the future is going to look like, usually based on historical modeling. They use historical numbers to model what the future might look like. We'll also need someone to translate that sales forecast into resource requirements, and that's important, okay? So if the forecast saying our sales will grow by 100,000 sales in Japan or China, then what does that mean for your resourcing? Where do you need most of your goods and services designed, produced? You might be a global enterprise, you know, you sell all the way around the world, but you're expecting demand in China or demand in Asia to be greater than demand in Europe. What does that mean for where you focus your resources? What does that mean for, you know, where you're going to invest more of your money, so on and so forth? Where are you going to perhaps hire more people? Where are you going to consider reducing the size of your workforce? These are all questions that are valid under a top-down approach, okay? And then finally, once you've considered the resource requirements, you will then start going about generating the production plans. Production plans can alter, they can be different. There's a number of reasons why. Firstly, you need to have clarity over what your organization is looking to achieve. Secondly, you need to have clarity over where you're going to go with your production planning process. So again, top-down numbers, yes, they might reflect reality, but they won't be 100% accurate. So most organizations will have what's called a kind of a buffer or a barrier, whereby they'll probably predict demand 10% higher and 10% lower and see what that looks like. So it's almost giving them a contingency. So when you look at organizational plans, you tend to see that they've got a plus 5% or a minus 5% contingency. depending on, how demand might fluctuate. That's probably most commonly seen in contact centers, etc. Call volume planning. It's difficult for contact center forecasters to forecast the exact number of calls, but what they definitely will do is they'll have a plus or minus 5%, just so that, if it does go higher, are they covered for resource? If it goes lower, do they have options for dropping people out or getting people to focus on other tasks? These are all things that are important. Okay. Major approaches to our S&OP. So what the kind of key approaches to our sales and operation planning? Well, level production plan is where the production is held constant and inventory is then used to absorb the differences between production and sales forecast. So as you can imagine, level is level, keep everything the same, don't change it. So you're holding your production constant, so you're still producing the same number of units this week or this month compared to last week or last month. But what you're doing instead is you're using the inventory that you may have built up to absorb any differences between the production and the sales forecast. So your sales forecast may be to sell 100,000 units, so you're planning to produce 100,000 units. However, there might have been, I don't know, exceptional circumstances, more customers decide to buy. So instead you sold 102,000. So you've already got a shortfall of 2,000 that you haven't made. So what your company will look to do is look to its inventory and say, do we have any stock that we built up, perhaps when our forecast wasn't met? So in some months, you might produce more than is actually needed. At that point, you build up an inventory, and that inventory can then be used as a buffer. It can be something to fall back on in case demand does go too high. And if demand is too small, again, it's somewhere for you to store the stock until demand recovers. Then we have what's called chase production plan. This is where production is changed in each time period to match the sales forecast. So this is when you actually think about, okay, do I actually want to have too much stock perhaps? Do I want to take the risk of having stock building up an inventory? It might be for perishable goods. So for example, say you produce bakery products. I mean, you don't want to have a year supply of bread because it's going to go off. You don't want to have, perishable goods going to waste. So what you tend to find is the chase production plan is what's used. And that basically is where you change your production levels to match the time period. So again, if you are a producer of, say, outdoor garden furniture, chances are in the winter time, your production or supply will be minimal. You're not going to produce too much because people aren't going to buy stuff for their garden because no one wants to go outside in the freezing cold. Whereas in the summer, you will probably ramp up your production because you know that customers will be looking to buy products to go in their garden. Obviously, it's a big lead time with these types of products. So you might argue, well, by the time summer comes, I might not get it to winter. Let's ignore that dynamic for a minute. Let's ignore the lead time. Let's just focus on the nature of the industry, the nature of the products, okay? So they will use the seasons, they will use the time of the year to determine when to send, when to produce the correct products. Finally, we have what's called a mixed production plan, and this is usually a variation of both inventory and production levels in an effort to develop what's called the most effective plan. So basically, it's when you recognize that being seasonal maybe doesn't work for your industry or maybe doesn't work for your product. People might still want to consume your product, maybe not in the same quantity, but they still want to consume your product all year round. So for example, ice cream sales probably are greater in the summer period. Everyone wants to have ice cream when it's hot outside, but people still eat ice cream in the winter too. If you go to a restaurant, you're likely to have dessert, and in that dessert, there may well be ice cream. It might not be ice cream on its own, but you might have ice cream on the side of your chocolate brownie or whatever you might decide to have. The point is, some people will say ice cream seasonal. Other people will argue that ice cream is an all year round product. So how do you decide, when and where to focus your production? Well, you can use what's called a mixed production plan. So you might have a certain level that you're constantly producing, but then at other times you might want to vary your inventory. So every month you might want to produce at least 10,000 litres of ice cream. but then in the summer months, you might want to jump up to 25,000 litres, for example, just to cover the extra demand. Okay, so there's three kind of key ways in which production varies. And that is important to us because depending on where we fit in the organisation and what our operational area is, we would need to know in order to make sure we can cover the demand, we can cover the forecast for production based on our resources. Any questions on those three approaches? Level, chase, and mixed? No? Okay. We then have what's called bottom-up planning approach. So we talked about this a little bit already. So again, it's similar to top-down planning, but the biggest difference is that your resource requirements are evaluated individually for each product or service. Okay, and they come across from all the different products and services. So again, someone that produces, fashion industry, you've got, different types of wear. You've got jeans, you've got shorts, you've got skirts, so on and so forth. Each product line will probably have its own expert. It'll have someone that you use to go to the market with, and they'll probably feed back, what's the appetite for jeans or denim products? What's the appetite for shorts? What's the appetite for skirts, designs, so on and so forth? And you will use that information to build up a picture of what demand is going to look like. So you're still building a picture, but instead of being forecasted from top down, it's bottom up. It's the people in each of those areas giving you their expectations and you using the aggregate of those expectations to come up with your production plan. But in both of these approaches, there's two things that are more important. Productivity. Productivity is a relationship between the output and the input of a business system. Okay, so remember, if we take your mind, cast your mind back to the very early parts of Friday's session, we talked about the transformation process or the input process output model. In any organization, you want your outputs to be greater than the sum of your inputs. Okay, so whatever you're putting into the system must be less than total value of what you're putting out. Otherwise, you're making a loss. Okay, stuff you're putting in costs you more than the stuff you're getting out. So output must always be greater than input. So in order to measure your productivity, your survival ratio must be at least 1. In order for you to be actually breaking even, the amount of cost that goes into your inputs must at the very least be equal to the cost of the output. But ideally, to be profitable and to be growth oriented, you want output to be greater than input. Again, another reason why the role of the operations manager is very important, because he or she is there to reduce the wastage. They don't want any of the input to go to waste. They want the input to be used as effectively and efficiently as possible to ensure that productivity is kept at a high rate. Importance of productivity. Some of the key areas are there for you on the slide. I'm not going to go into detail on them all because I feel like some of them are quite self-explanatory, but generally speaking, it's all about your gains from productivity. Okay, how can you use those gains? Maybe you can transfer them to the customer. Maybe you can offer lower prices than your competitors and therefore get even more custom. Maybe it is gains that can also be shared with your workers or your employees. So perhaps you can lift their wages because they are so efficient, they're so effective, you're making cost savings, you're making more money, you can pass that off to your employees. Maybe it's more about generating future employment opportunities. So again, if your company's efficient, you're saving money, you can invest more on growing, you can have more jobs, more opportunities for your people. But really, at the fundamental level, the proportional increase of your output should always be greater than the proportional increase of your input. Okay, so the growth in output should always outweigh the growth in input for any decision that you make. Otherwise, you're basically throwing money down the drain. Okay, so input growth, which is natural. I mean, if you're trying to serve more customers, serve more markets, you're going to need more inputs. But it's down to you to make sure that those inputs aren't going to waste. Those inputs are being used effectively to ensure that the output is continuously growing and the rate at which it is growing is greater than the rate at which your inputs are growing. Productivity measurement. Now, productivity can be measured in a few different ways, either on what we call an aggregate basis or on an individual basis. Either way, these are called total and partial measures. Okay, so for total productivity, we're looking at total output divided by total input. So we've already said that already, which basically is your total production of goods and services divided by the labor, the material, the capital, the energy, and your management function that's going into it. How you put a number on that can be a lot of different ways. Organizations have their own ways of doing that. How do they measure? Can it be, in pounds and pence, or, dollars or cents, whatever? Can it be in time? Can it be based on efficiencies? There's lots of different ways to measure your productivity, your labor, your materials, your capital, your energy, and your management component. But cost tends to be the most consistent one, because cost is usually the easiest thing to measure. So in order to work out your productivity index, your productivity measure, we want to divide the total production of goods and services, so how much that is worth on the market, by the total input of labor, the total input of your material and your resources, total input of any capital that you put into your business, any energy that's being used, and whatever management functions, costs predominantly, are going in as well. Naturally, as you can imagine, it's all about efficiencies in operations. So it's all about how do you improve your productivity? How do you make the top line of that equation be higher than the bottom line? Well, higher productivity leads to what we know as national prosperity. Okay, so the government measures total gross domestic product as a sign of whether the economy is doing well or the economy is struggling. So the greater the productivity, the greater the gross domestic product. Okay, and therefore the better standards for community as a whole. Now, the methods contribute to improving the productivity are methods such as the study and work measurement by reducing work content and ineffective time. So there's been research that's been conducted that's shown there's no real one best solution for productivity improvement, but instead it's a focus on the content of the work and the ineffective time. Now, these two concepts are explained below. So work content means that the amount of work contained in a given product or process, which can be measured in man hours or machine hours. Okay, so how many man hours are required to complete this product? Now, that could be 2 hours of my time, 2 hours of your time, 2 hours of someone else's time to complete the final product, or it could just be 4 or 5 hours of my time alone. That's what you use. Okay, you would express something by number of man hours or machine hours. So if it's a machine produced product, how many hours of running does the machine need to do in order to produce that product? However, in some cases, like in processing industries, we actually have actual operation times which are far in excess of what we call the theoretical minimum. So theoretical minimum being 1, which we've already discussed. In some processing industries, because of the nature of machinery, the nature of technology, you can achieve quite a significantly higher productivity. Machines can do a lot more than humans ever will be able to do. So you sometimes find that in the context of a technology savvy or a technology heavy industry, their productivity is insanely high. So for example, newspaper printing, mostly done by machines, and the number of newspapers that are printed, even per second, per minute, is significantly higher than what was the case 50, 60 years ago. Okay, so productivity is an interesting measure, but you have to take a pinch of salt depending on what industry you're looking at. So that's just one caveat. We also have what's called ineffective time. Now, ineffective time is a time for which the worker or the machine are both idle due to the shortcomings of either management or the worker. So for example, perhaps you haven't forecasted enough demand or enough work, so your people don't have any work to do. So you haven't got the resources on time. You haven't envisaged that you would run out of a particular resource or a particular thing. So ineffective time is basically time for which the worker or the machine are both idle. So why is the worker not working? If I'm at work right now, it's in my employer's best interest for me to be used as much as possible. If I'm sitting here playing video games rather than talking to you right now, and I'm still being paid for it, then it's a loss of my employer's money. It's a loss of my employer's time. Similarly, if it's a machine-based organization, say newspaper printing industry, if the machines run out of ink and it can't print, then that's idle time or ineffective time. The machine is down, nothing's being printed, it's a waste. We also have what's called the production system. The production system should be quite familiar to you because it's similar to the input process output model, okay? So it's basically a system whose function is to transform the input into a desired output by means of process and the addition of resources. The definition of a production system is thus based on four main elements, and these are the input, the resources, the production process, and the output. Most of the organizations that we come across in day-to-day life, whether it's public sector, private sector, third sector, government, so on and so forth, can be described as production systems, okay? Why? Because these organizations transform or convert a set of inputs, such as material, labor, equipment, energy, so on and so forth, and they turn it into one or more useful outputs. And these outputs of the production system are normally called products, okay? So you might consume a service, you might consume a product. These are all some things or some output that have gone through a process. Somebody somewhere has combined something, done something, changed something to give you the output that you're consuming, whether it's when you buy a McDonald's, whether it's when you consume a service such as watching a film, whether it is when you watch television and you're watching Netflix. Someone somewhere has created that Netflix show. There's been a combination of resources that have created that Netflix show for you to watch, okay? So it's all part of a production system. Almost everything we do in life has a production system underpinning it. So this is what the production system looks like. And as I was saying, you should be fairly familiar with this, if not completely familiar. The inputs go into the transformation process. Transformation process yields what we call the outputs, okay? That's just how it works. And what we do have inside the production process, though, is what are called feedback or requirement loops. So essentially, input goes into transformation. Transformation turns it into an output, but that output is then used to provide feedback and requirements. Okay, so output provides feedback to the transformation process. Perhaps the quality was weak. Perhaps it didn't turn out the way we wanted it to turn out. So what does that mean? We go back to the transformation process. We try and understand what went wrong. Why were we not able to produce it the way we wanted to? And you might find it was down to the quality of the input. So again, that gets fed back to the input process. And you start thinking about, okay, where do we source these products from? Who's the supplier? What's the quality of their products? So on and so forth. So that's how the feedback loop works, okay? You either feedback iteratively, so from one stage to the next, or it could just be straight back into input. The finished goods aren't good enough. Let's go back to the inputs and figure out what we need to do differently. Okay, so feedback and requirements are quite important. Types of production systems. So there's four key types that we want to reference here. And companies mainly use these four to essentially put their output into the market. The requirements of a production system depend on the type of product the customer is offering and the strategy that it employs to serve its customers. And the classification is explained in the table to the left. So where you're doing production in high volume, so for example, the production of pencils. So we all know HB pencils, we probably use pens or pencils in our life at some point. They're produced in volume, okay? They're produced by the hundreds or the thousands. No one's going to sit there and produce one pencil one at a time because it's just not worth your time and effort. So volume is important. Or the newspaper industry, newspapers are printed off hundreds, if not thousands, every hour are printed off the press run. That's called continuous production. You then have what's called mass production. So mass production is where you are producing in high volumes, but maybe not the same as continuous, okay? Newspapers are printed every single day for each day of the calendar year, most of the time. So, you know, that's continuous, it's non-stop. But mass production is where perhaps you have introduced a new product and you know that demand's going to be high for the first couple of weeks. So you're producing a lot. So you may be producing 10,000 rather than a normal 3,000 or 4,000 that you do of other products. Once that initial demand is over, you then come back to a level production. You know, you may only produce 2,000 or 3,000 a day, or 2,000 or 3,000 a week, so on and so forth, to meet the ongoing demand. So mass production is all about similar to continuous, but it's not every single day. You know, it's more fluctuating. There'll be times in which mass is greater, times when mass is not as profound. Batch production. Batch production tends to be things like when you go to a bakery, you tend to find stuff that's sold in a batch. You might get a dozen of something. You might get half a dozen. It's all in batch. Okay, batch sizes are important. Loaves are also sold in batches. So bread, you're consuming bread, is sold by the batch. So batch is more around the grouping of products. How many groups of products do we need to sell? How do we group them together? And finally, we have what's called job shop production. The job shop production tends to be the most expensive, and it's also something that tends to be produced in low volume. So this is very much customization. So this is when perhaps you want to buy a new house, but you want to customize so that, you know, you've got all the latest technology and features, and you want to change the layout of the room, or you want to change where the window is. That's a job product. Okay, the company will charge you more money for changing the design. They'll do it for you, but it'll be called a job shop. Okay, it'll be a specific set of requirements that you have asked for, that you've designed. Similarly, if you customize products, so say you're a football fan, you want to buy a football top with a specific name on the back, say you want your own surname or your own name on the back, then that's what's called a job shop. Okay, that's a specific name, a specific number, a specific symbol you want in the back of your shirt. Then it's not something that they're going to sell to anyone else, because it's quite unique to you, and they'll probably charge you a premium for providing that service. Okay, so those are different production systems that are important for us to be aware of. Organizing for and implementing sales and operations planning. Well, there's a few questions that you want to ask when we're choosing between alternative plans. Firstly, what impact will the plan have on key suppliers and the transportation system? What are the cash flows going to be like? Do the supply chain partners and the firm itself have the space needed to hold any of the planned inventories? Does the plan contain significant changes in the workforce? And how flexible is that plan? These are relevant questions you want to ask before choosing which plan to go for, okay? What's the impact on your suppliers? What does the cash flow maybe look like? How do you have to pay for those goods and services? How does the money coming into your business cover the outgoings? What does your supply chain look like? Will your partners be able to meet your demand and your needs? How does the plan contain significant changes? You know, how will it change the way in which your company is structured, the way in which you utilize or employ your resources? And finally, how flexible is that plan? What can you do with that plan? So what we're doing is we're organizing for and implementing a sales and operations plan. Essentially, we're asking ourselves this question. We need to generate a sales and operations plan. Okay, the question we ask ourselves is the plan acceptable to all participants? If the answer is no, you're basically iterating, you're fine-tuning, you're going back and saying, we need to generate a new plan, we need to come up with a different way of understanding how we can deliver on this product or service. If the answer then becomes yes, the plan is acceptable to all the participants, you would then proceed with implementing the plan. So it's quite an iterative process. Don't expect to get it right first time. Even the most skilled or the most experienced operations managers will have a few iterations to make sure that they're meeting the needs of their stakeholders, to make sure that no one is being left adversely worse off than otherwise they would have in the first place. We also need to be aware of what it means to organize for and implement an S&OP. So how do we kind of have what's called a rolling plan horizon? So a planning approach in which an organization updates its sales and operations plan regularly, such as on a monthly or a quarterly basis. So for example, you might find that, you know, when it's in October, you're looking at sales and operations plans specifically between a window. But then when it gets to November, you move that window shifts. You're looking at it between November and February, January, rather than January, December, when you're in October, okay? So it's that quarterly window. It can be in and semi-annually. Some people look at 6-month windows. It can be monthly windows. It can be different forms. Thirds aren't very common, but you do sometimes have some companies that look at it every third of the year. So every 4 months, what's it going to look like for us? So just different ways in which time horizons, or what we call rolling plan horizons, can evolve our thinking, can impact how we understand what the needs and the wants are on our organization. In order to implement a successful sales and operations planning approach in an organization, there are 3 distinct phases that we need to follow. Firstly, you've got to develop the foundation. What do you mean by that? It's about creating the right environment, the right mentality, the right structural approach in your organization that you can build a successful operations plan. It's about integrating and streamlining the process. So again, it's that iterative nature, okay? It's not just about coming up with something once and then sticking to that as if it's gospel. It's taking that plan and saying, okay, why doesn't this work? What's not good about it? Who does it not meet the needs of? Which stakeholders are affected? What can we do to improve the plan? What needs to change? What needs to be more streamlined? What needs to be more efficient? And if you can do that effectively, by the end of that process, you will be able to achieve the competitive advantage. And that's the final step in your S&OP, okay? The reason for you going through that hardship, the reason for you going through that process is to gain something for your organization. And in any business context, whether you're looking at it from a strategic angle or a marketing angle or any angle at all, really, competitive advantage is what will drive your organization to success, okay? It's what makes your company stand out in the market. It's what gives your company the edge. So competitive advantage is always the ultimate goal, because that's what will deliver you growth. That's what will deliver you the profits you desire. We also have service considerations. So we talked a lot about production, particularly around producing, whether it's automobiles, whether it's producing clothes. A lot of the examples we've used have been around production, but services, the same logic can apply. So it's all about making sales match your capacity, okay? So a couple of techniques for doing that are around yield management. It's an approach that services commonly use with highly perishable products in which prices are regularly adjusted to maximize the total profit. Best example I can give you is when you go to the grocery store. So if anyone's doing a grocery run tonight, it's just gone past 6 o'clock. Chances are somebody in the supermarket right now is going around with a trolley, putting on yellow price reduction stickers because products that have a sell by date or a use by date of today are still on the shelves, and if they're not sold by tonight, they're going to go in the bin and they're going to be wasted. So for an organization, they want to maximize whatever return they can on that product, so they're going to reduce the price, even if it means that they have to sell it at a slight loss, because a slight loss is better than a full loss, okay? So price reductions are common. You tend to find there's a couple of shelves, usually in each section, one in the cold food section, one in the bakery section, one in the general kind of everyday food section, that has products that are approaching, if not on their sell by date, that the organization needs to sell, otherwise it will be binned and scrapped, okay? So that's what's called yield management. That's just one example of it. That's not the only example, but yield management is all about making sure you're adjusting your prices to maximize the total gain that you can from selling that product. When demand levels are lower than expected, yield management systems can boost demand by lowering the price, but only if the expected result is an increase in total profit. So this is when perhaps, for example, you were anticipating that you would sell 10,000 units of the product, but you've only sold 5,000 so far this month. Why might you consider reducing the price? Well, you might want to reduce the price by 50 or 100 pounds as a promotion, with the expectation that that will lead to a boost in a number of sales and lead to more sales over the course of the rest of the month. So you may actually have to raise your production to meet the new demand, because all of a sudden the demand has gone up because the price has fallen. More people are able to afford the product. They're more willing to pay for the product. Take Black Friday, for example. We're now approaching that time of the year where a lot of retailers are discounting heavily. Amazon have already started theirs. A lot of the big retailers have already started it as well. It's no longer Black Friday as a day. It's now Black Friday as a week in most instances. A lot of organizations are heavily discounting, A, because they want to get rid of some stock, but B, because they want to try and drum up support and demand for their production processes, especially when it comes to own brand products. So if you look at Amazon right now, one of the first things you see when you click on Amazon's Black Friday is Amazon products. They're promoting their own products. They're doing that because they want to be able to A, drum up demand, but B, try and get their products out into the market. Okay, it's about a way in which you can raise the profile of your product. However, the opposite also applies. When demand levels are higher than expected, prices often go up, but only if the expected result, again, is a higher total profit. So again, you might find that all of a sudden, what was back in fashion? Say, there was a phase when everybody wanted to have the fidget spinners. So I don't know if anyone recalls them, or if anyone's got children that went through the phase when fidget spinners were the big thing. There's a point at which there wasn't enough supply of fidget spinners that people were actually selling them back on the black market for 3 or 4 times the value. Okay. And what eventually happened once supply came back in was the price went up. The price at which fidget spinners were originally being sold for wasn't cheap, but it was a good price. But they quickly realized that the demand was so great that they could afford to raise the price. And yes, some customers might not be able to afford it, but the vast majority still could. And therefore, they were able to make extra profit on those extra units that they produced. Okay. So sometimes when your demand is higher than expected, you can raise your prices, but you should only do so if you're confident that it will still result in you making more profit and not less. So based on that, we can deduce that total profit is equal to our average profit per service of units sold multiplied by the number of service units that we're selling. Okay. So again, how much profit do we make per service unit that we sell, multiplied by a number of services that we are selling to the market. A couple of things to consider. Firstly, making capacity match your sales. Tiered workforces are a strategy used to vary the workforce levels in which additional full-time or part-time employees are hired during peak demand periods, whilst a smaller permanent staff pool is continually maintained all year round. So again, you'll sometimes find organizations will ramp up their employment in the lead up to Christmas. Why? Because the demand at Christmas tends to be greater, and therefore they need more staff. So good examples are retailers. You tend to find retail companies will hire more people in the lead up to Christmas because that's when they expect demand to be greater. People will be in the shops buying more stuff. So they will ramp up their employment. But then after Christmas, they tend to ditch them because they know that people aren't going to shop as often. So they'll probably end up shedding their workforce. So they might bring them in on temporary contracts. They might bring them in on 0-hour contract, whatever they might do. There's different ways in which companies get around it. But it's where you basically create a tiered workforce. You have a small supply of permanent staff who are there and employed for many years, but you then update them with additional staff as you go along, depending on, again, the level of demand you anticipate you will get. Offloading is a strategy that's used for reducing or smoothing out the workforce requirements that often involves having customers perform part of the work themselves. So again, you might be thinking, what kind of work is this? Well, basically, it's when you try and find a way in which the service can still be delivered, but by you not having to do as much as you previously did. Okay, so what parts of the service provision can be passed off to the customer? Maybe in return for a lower price, so customers are like, okay, I'm happy to do that myself now. I don't need someone to do that for me. In return for a lower price. Examples are things like technology installations. If we to go back 20, 25 years when PCs and desktops were first and markets became commercial products, in the 1990s, technical configuration or technology setup was part of the service. When you paid for a laptop or you paid for a computer, you expected them to do that as part of the service. Fast forward 25 years, it's now an add-on service. Basically, what companies have done is they've offloaded it. They now expect us, because we're now more technology savvy, because we now have people that are more able to operate these types of technology, people that are more aware of how to operate these technologies, they've understood that not all customers want them to install the technology for them or set it all up for them. So they've started charging that as an extra service. They've offloaded the free part of it for you to do by yourself. No longer do you get it ready to potentially use out the box. A lot of them are, but you start to install your own software, you start to install your own drivers, you need to install some of the kind of parts that you need to use, your component parts, so on and so forth. You set up your Wi-Fi, etc. However, they still provide you the option to do that. So for example, John Lewis, you might shop with John Lewis, you might have heard of John Lewis. They charge you extra for coming to install your TV for you, for coming to set up your technology for you. So that's an example of offloading, okay? They've offloaded the service that previously a lot of organizations did provide, but now they're charging a premium for it. So how do you link that through your supply chain? Well, your supply chain is important because at the end of the day, the customer is your end user, okay? So whatever you do in your supply chain is all to deliver value for your customer, but the customer is just a small part of it. You've got upstream suppliers, you've got people that provide your suppliers who then supply you, and then you might supply someone else before it eventually goes to the customer. So what's important here is your S&OP processes should not only consider the impact on you, but also the different parties that are involved. So if your sales and operating planning is going to reduce the amount of products you produce, it's going to reduce the requirements for the products that you design, how does that impact the suppliers? Do you still need their products? Are they still going to buy your products to fit into theirs? These are all questions that need to be answered. So your operating plan is not just for you, it's also quite important for your supply chain. A typical model of an S&OP process looks something like this, okay? You have 4 different elements that come together to form the review that goes into your sales and operations plan. You've got demand review, supply review, new product activities, and financial review. Now, some of these are obvious. So financial review is obviously making sure that you can budget for it. Okay, you've got the cash flow, you've got money coming in and out of your organization that can pay for whatever you're looking to do. New product activities, again, quite self-explanatory. Is there anything changing in your production process? Are you introducing new production lines? Are you introducing new technologies that will change the way in which you work? But demand and supply are the key ones, okay? So demand is all about making sure that the ultimate goal is achieved, and that is to be able to gain consensus on what will be sold and what revenue will be produced from that sale. Participants often discuss factors that influence the demand and agree on a single demand plan that is then passed. So again, people participating in the demand review, and it tends to be your operations level managers, it tends to be perhaps part of the senior management team, people from sales and marketing, they will all play a role in understanding what demand looks like for a certain product or service. We then have a supply review. Supply review is basically creating a supply chain that includes rough cut capacity plans, procurement plans, and accompanying costs. I've intentionally not gone into detail here because I feel like we've been through these points in a lot of depth already over the course of the lecture last week and earlier on today. But essentially, it's a combination of your demand and supply that will drive the key elements of your sales and operating plan. And finally, we talked about this at the beginning as well, the sales and the operating planning meeting. The purpose of that is to discuss and resolve any imbalances between supply and demand. It's about making sure decisions that are published are done as a single authorized plan, i.e. everyone's on board. And that means if you have to iterate more than once, then you do it, okay? You go back and forward, you make sure that what you're doing meets the requirements of your end customer, meets the requirements of your supply chain, meets the requirements of the different component parts that are affected by your decision. What are the benefits of doing that? Well, I think they're quite self-explanatory, to be honest. But again, I've put them up on the screen there for you. If anyone's not sure about any of them, just shout out. But I think they are, and by and large, pretty self-explanatory. Why would you want to have a directly relevant sales and operating plan? Well, these are some of the benefits that you might be able to derive from doing so. A couple of tips for a successful planning process. Well, you want to include specific schedules and participants. So who's involved? Why are they involved? What do they do? You want to identify the KPIs that are important at the beginning. What is the key performance indicators for you to capture what's going on in your organization? Having an attitude of continuous improvement. So again, having something set up in your organization that you're continuously looking at ways in which you can improve what you're doing. Stabilizing the demand planning process. It's all about making sure that your demand or your demand planning forecasting is consistent. What you don't want to do is find that you've forecasted something, but the actual is very, very different, because then that means A, you've wasted time and resource forecasting, and B, your plans are going to be out of canter. They're not going to reflect reality. And one of the ways you can do that is having a successful planning process, having meetings, having demand and supply reviews to make sure that your plans are reflective of what's going on in the industry. So today I'm going to do something slightly different. Usually I have a break and then I make you stop, but today I'm actually going to give you a little bit of homework to do. And this is to actually help you for your assignment as well, because your assignment looks at understanding what you would do if you were an operations manager. So doing a small task based on today's lecture and on what you might have learned on Friday too, if that helps you. I want you to choose a large corporation of your choice. It needs to be a large corporation because you need to be able to research them, okay? So someone that's maybe listed on the FTSE 100 in the UK, NASDAQ, Dow Jones, Fortune 500, so on and so forth. Someone that you can easily find a lot of information about on the internet. I want you to assume the role of an operations manager for a specific product group within that organization. So you may choose to go for car manufacturers. So you might decide to choose, you know, BMW, and you might want to choose a specific car that you know has been successful, you know, maybe the 4x4, the X5 series. You might want to choose something slightly different. You may want to choose, you know, an electronic manufacturer. So maybe looking at Samsung, or maybe looking at someone along those lines, and understanding, you know, what products offerings for maybe televisions, maybe washing machines. I don't know, it's completely up to you. It's your choice, but you're the operations manager, okay? You're the one that's in charge of making sure that the supply and the activities that underpin the process are all there. So what do you have to do? I want you to tell me how you would approach the sales and operating planning process. So based on what you've learned today, and based on your assumed position as an operations manager in a particular department or product unit in any organization of your choice, how would you approach the sales and operating plan? What kind of things are important to your organization? So what's important here is for you to think about type of organization. Are they product oriented? Are they service oriented? You know, why do they exist? What do they provide? And what, you know, what's the purpose of your organization? And be prepared to share your answer with me on Wednesday. Everyone clear on their task and what they have to do?
Hiya, I'm not be there on Wednesday. I'm stuck at work.
Oh, you're not going to. Ah, okay. The next lecture is on Wednesday, which is why I set it for Wednesday. If you still want to do it, feel free to do it, and you can always send it to me separately if that's something you'd like to do. The reason I made Wednesday a deadline was because the next lecture is on Wednesday, which is why I thought it'd be quite nice for you to come to a lecture and have something to hand. But that's absolutely fine. Don't worry if you can't make it along on Wednesday. The reason I want you to do this is more for your own benefit, because for your assignment, you'll be doing a task around where you have to assume the role of an operations manager and tell me about how you would do things. So this should hopefully be an effective way if we start thinking about your assignment as well.
Yeah.
Okay, fabulous. Any other questions or anything anyone wants to ask? No? Okay, that's good. Great to hear. Sounds like I've done a fairly good job then of explaining it, if there's no questions. I'll just quickly cover off what we're going to be talking about next in the final lecture for the series, which is on specifically strategies for operating planning and how operations management fit into the wider strategic management process. Okay, so we've been looking at a very specific component part. We've been looking at operations management, but what does operations mean? How does operations fit into the kind of longer term strategic perspective? So we'll start introducing concepts from strategy and try to position operations management in the context of the wider functioning, I should say, of strategic management. Okay. Right, if there aren't any questions, I will bid you farewell. Enjoy what's left of your evening, and I look forward to hearing your responses on Wednesday for those of you that will be attending the lecture. Okay, thank you now.